and welcome to On the Money, where the business of Russia is business. I'm Peter Lavelle. Today, we're talking about Russia on offer, Russian companies, and initial public offerings. To discuss this, I'm joined by Daniel Salter here in the studio with me. He is Chief EMEA Equity Strategist at Unicredit Securities. We also have Denis Ludkovский. He is CEO at Связной group of companies. Ben Aris, he is Editor-in-Chief at Business New Europe. And Natalia Orlova, she is Chief Economist at Alpha Bank. All right, Daniel, I want to start with you first here. Let's go back to 2006, 2007. That was the last time we had a real slew of IPOs, Russian IPOs. Then we had the financial crisis, and now again, we have another slew of IPOs coming from Russia. Listing elsewhere, we'll get to that later. What's different now than in 2006 and 2007?
I think what we saw in 2006 and 2007 was the Russian economy was really booming at this stage. And a lot of the companies listing in 2006 to 2007 were new companies in their sector. So it was going to be the first representative of the retail sector or the real estate sector. Lots of new sectors were coming to the market. People wanted to get exposure to this fast-growing country, to these new sectors. And they paid a pretty high valuation for companies and sectors they didn't know very well. And then they found they'd overpaid. In the downturn, they lost a lot of money. And it's a case now of once bitten, twice shy. So the investors at this point are doing a lot of due diligence into the companies they're investing in. They're very sensitive on valuation. And there's a bit more competition. So if a company is listing, it's now not the only company in that sector. There's a wider range of choice in the Russian market. So people are a lot more careful.
A lot more sophistication, you're saying?
Sophistication. They don't want to make the same mistake that they made in the last bull market.
Natalia, if I can go to you, last year the whole story was about bonds, and a little bit into this year. What has changed? Why all of a sudden the interest in Russian equities?
Well, I think this year and basically starting end of 2010, we definitely have seen the increase in the oil prices, which is usually, as Russian economy is still very much based on commodity, have boost valuation of Russian equities. I think these definitely improved the perception of international investors for the Russian companies, and this was really probably the arguments for the Russian companies to think again about IPOs as opposed to thinking about bond market, which was used previous years. Also, I think additional point is the privatization list, which was announced by the Russian government quite recently. So I think while in terms of privatization, we are mainly talking about SPOs, only few companies will be offered for IPOs by the government, but still I think this privatization list have improved and also increased the overall interest for the Russian market. So this is definitely seen as a window of opportunity for the non-state Russian companies also to present their story for the investors.
Well, it's interesting, Natalia, you got really ahead of me because I wanted to talk about privatization later. But Dennis, if I can go to you, what are companies thinking about now when they're mulling an IPO? Again, Daniel gave us a few points here, but the companies are actually doing it right now. What are the things that are challenging them the most when they want to go down this road?
No, Peter, I think the first thing that companies are looking at is what state are they in currently? Can they actually fully organize an IPO, or will they go a different route of raising cash necessary for their business and expansion? There's always the option of private placement. There's always the option of debt. But if a company is in a sophisticated state of its management structure and basically following some of the recommended principles of, let's say, IFRS accounting, then IPO is definitely a much better option. I think the companies are also looking at what is the inherent motivation, meaning what split do they do between primary and secondary? Is it basically a cash out, or is it basically a cash that's necessary to fund the operation or to fund a new project? So these are some of the things that are going through the minds of the companies that are currently listing or about to list.
Ben, if I can go to you, if we can put Russian companies into a context of emerging markets in Eastern Europe, how are the Russians playing out here compared to their peers in Eastern Europe? And I'm looking at an emerging market setting.
Well, Russia's far ahead in so much as it's got by far the most sophisticated financial market of any of the countries in the region. I mean, if you imagine the whole of the CIS, the capitalization of the market, something on the order of $2 trillion, half of that is Russia. And daily trading volumes here are in the billions of dollars, whereas somewhere like Ukraine, which is the next biggest market, they're in the tens of millions. And that depth of the market gives companies here the option of raising significant amounts of money. So companies like Denis's Svязной, if they want to go abroad, they can raise money there, but there's also the option now of doing it domestically. And that's a huge advantage. I mean, companies that are looking to expand, that need money, cash to invest, they can tap the domestic market if they need to.
Daniel, recently there's been a lot of commentary that the Russian companies, when they IPO, because some have been withdrawn, are pricing themselves too aggressively. I mean, obviously you want to get as much money as you can when you go public, but have the Russians been over-aggressive?
I think there were some cases of that in the past. However, there's a price for everything. So, you know, the investors will pay a certain price, the companies will accept a certain price. And I think the idea of the market is to match the supply and demand. So there's been a perception that Russian companies were too aggressive, but it's changing now. If you look at the most recent IPOs in Russia, some of them have cut the price range, some of them have priced even at the bottom of the range. So I think companies are accepting now that they should leave some upside for investors on the table so that both parties get what they want. The company gets the money and the investors get a return. That's how the market should work.
Does any of this play into the roadshow? Because this is something relatively new for Russian companies. I mean, IPOing is new for a lot of Russian companies. How important is the roadshow? Because it's a lot about corporate culture, too, getting the right kind of mix. I mean, if you're asking somebody for a lot of money, they're going to want to kind of get to know you, yeah, and get to know your culture and what you're going to do with the money. I mean, there is a kind of a human element here, a cultural element that are they bridging that gap?
That's exactly right. I think, you know, companies need to establish a relationship over the long term with markets. It's very difficult in a half-an-hour meeting with a company to really assess how good they're going to be in the future, how successful they'll be. I mentioned the idea about due diligence. I was looking today at the IPO prospectus for Rusal. It was 1,141 pages long, so there's a lot of due diligence going on. But, you know, it's much better to meet the company face-to-face, really understand what the management's like, how they're going to deliver the growth in the future, what their ideas are, and, you know, do they seem to be decent people who you can look in the eye and understand what their motivations are?
And Dennis, if I can go to you, has the perception of dealing with Russian companies changed on the one hand when we're looking at foreign investors and the way Russian companies are going to market now? What is the Russian companies finding most difficult, most challenging when going public?
I think it's a question of what are they willing to change in their everyday management structure in order to become as visible and transparent as possible to the Western investor. I think obviously corporate governance is a very difficult issue for most Russian companies to overcome. I believe disclosure is something that's also very difficult for Russian companies to get a hold of and hang of. But I think more and more you will see that the Russian companies that are looking at listing and have listed so far have found it a very useful exercise in their management structures. Just the fact that you're actually able to attract a different client or let's say a different investor for your company allows you to actually get better people on board. You can align management and shareholder interests given the fact that you have a share plan that you can offer to your employees. So I think basically those two things. It's not so much about doing the day-to-day business, it's actually talking about the way you do the day-to-day business, and a lot of the reporting is a difficulty in terms of the Russian companies.
Dennis, if I can stay with you, because I want to ask everybody on the panel about this. You know, we see all these companies IPOing on foreign markets, foreign exchanges, okay? And not in Russia. So why are they doing it there? It's a hard question. It's something that the Russians are not happy about. We know that Mr. Medvedev isn't happy about it. He's even said that Russia is only halfway there in being able to do this. What is the biggest drawback or the disincentive for Russian companies to list at home?
Well, I think probably the easiest way to answer that question is if you look at the MySex and the RTS combined, they probably do about 500 billion worth of trading annually. If you look at just the London Stock Exchange, you're looking at 2.7 trillion cash flowing through that particular exchange. And I think that once again, the liquidity of the stock that is being traded publicly in a Western exchange is traded at a premium. You have the opportunity later, if you want to increase your debt as well, to do it at a cheaper rate than you would with a Russian listing. Obviously, you also have the opportunity to be indexed with some of the Western indexes. So I think it's not only to show that you can list in a Western country. It's also the fact that you're given a much better opportunity to attract better investors.
Ben, would you add anything to that?
Definitely. I mean, the big difference between the Russian market and the Western market is the quality of the investors. You have a very deep pool of investors, pension funds, insurance funds who are in for the long term. And that gives a basis to your stock price. Those guys hold and wait for the company to mature. The problem with Russia is that although the market's relatively big, it's extremely shallow. I mean, the whole institutional investor segment of the market here is completely missing. And consequently, most of the investors on the Russian market are banks or foreign funds, hedge funds, what have you, and they have a very short-term perspective, 6 months. And so that makes the Russian market very volatile. You know, when it's having a good year, it goes shooting up, but about sort of 1 in every 10 years, it goes south, and then it can lose 75% of its value. So it's a quality of investor that Russian companies are looking for when they go abroad, long-term.
Daniel, right before we go to the break, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's pretty much right. It's all about a stable base of investors which you can attract overseas. And so far in Russia, you know, pension reform will change that. Once we get domestic investors in Russia, they'll be buying Russian stocks long term, doing their own due diligence. So I think that's the challenge for Russia, to bring up those long-term investors to the market.
We have to go to a break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russian IPOs. Stay with RT.
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy with Max Kaiser. For a no-holds-barred look at the global financial headlines, tune in to Kaiser Report on RT.
20 years ago, the largest country in the world disintegrated. What had been one became many, and each began a journey. Where did it take them?
Welcome back to On the Money. I'm Peter Lavelle, and we're discussing Russian companies and IPOs. But first, let's have a quick recap of Russia's experience with IPOs.
Russian companies bringing themselves to the market, particularly international listings, need to have both a solid business case and a commitment to selling that business case to major investors.
Of course, investors cannot rely only on the analyst research or just the overall understanding of the company. So all the investors making their own decision mostly based on the one-on-one meetings with the management to raise questions, to understand how management is capable, etc. And of course, the proper organized professional roadshow is a key for success.
Although Russian corporate culture has come a long way in the last decade, the listing process can still be quite challenging.
The corporate culture, the transparency, the preparedness of the owners of the business, to come sort of out openly and talk about the ownership structure, which sometimes continues to be an issue in the company, to disclose ultimate beneficiaries of the business, to disclose the in-house sort of stuff that usually was kept away from the public eye. So that is a huge cultural change for the Russian business in general, regardless of the place of the listing.
Companies making the effort to list then have access to equity funding, with the deeper pockets of major global centers a key attraction for international listing.
There is an obvious interest from the Russian investors, but the financial market in Russia is growing, but it's still much less than the developed financial markets in the world. So, of course, the amount of our asset under management in Russia not as significant as in typical financial centers like US, Europe, and Asia.
The more companies listing creates more of a market, and this is in turn makes it easier for other companies to consider the same step.
I think it is important. It is important because that provides a broader view on the industry for the outside market participants. The transparency on the market, the amount of liquidity on the market actually creates the market itself. If you have just two corporations listed, people don't have a visibility, there is no market.
But timing the market remains a key issue. With the global outlook still seen as precarious, Russian companies looking to place equity need to get their listing process right. Maria Novikova, On the Money, RT.
Okay, Natalia, if I can go back to you. It's interesting. Can we put this all into a global environment here? We have a lot of volatility when it comes to oil prices. We have events playing out in the greater Middle East where no one can predict an outcome. The U.S. is still grappling with its deficit, and the dollar is volatile as well. I mean, how do Russian companies go out and market themselves with this tsunami going on in the world?
Well, I think at the moment, definitely this global volatility is, I would say, playing favor to Russia and to Russian companies, because I think it's Russia is still, as I mentioned, seen as a commodity-driven economy and commodity-driven equity story. So as a result, I think at the moment, the fact of having oil prices skyrocketing thanks to this, Middle East developing, North African and global world instability, this is rather helping Russian companies to present themselves, because I think here, as opposed to pre-crisis story, while pre-crisis Russian companies was positioning themselves as companies willing to diversify, companies willing to go to the new markets, companies willing to increase their competitive advantage. I think right now first, we don't have a lot of IPOs. Second, the IPOs we have seen this year, these are companies which wanted to present their shares for investors for already some time. So I think at the moment this is rather the window of opportunity for those companies which were already willing, to come to see investors and just using global environment. And this is definitely at the moment playing favor to Russia. But I agree completely, when oil prices will go down, then we'll see probably a very sharp reversal of sentiment, and this is probably the reason which is now boosting some companies to speed up this IPO process.
Ben, the thought just came through my mind as Natalia was speaking. Could Russia and its IPOs be a flight to quality? I mean, with all this volatility, I mean, Russia that's what it makes Russia an additional reason to make it look attractive.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember, in the spring of 2008, as the subprime crisis was unwinding, Russia was billed as a safe haven. Of course, the crisis hit Russia a lot harder than anyone was expecting. And now we're back in the same position. I mean, the macro fundamentals of the country are rock solid. It's got a tiny debt. It's got a budget deficit which is shrinking rapidly. The hard currency reserves are almost back to where they were before the crisis, and so on. It looks very solid. But the point, I think, here is underestimated. I mean, Natalia alluded to Russia is seen as a commodity play. However, in the meantime, it's the consumers that are becoming the driving force of the economy, and they account for not half of the GDP. And one topic we haven't touched on is that Russia is, unlike the other emerging markets, is still traded at a heavy discount. The valuations are still much lower than in all the other emerging markets. And yet, over the last 10 years, Russia has outperformed every other emerging market by a factor of 4. Over the last decade, Russia returned 700%, and the next best performing market was China, with just under 200%. And that's based on the earnings, and the earnings are based on the consumers. And so people are slowly getting to know this story. If you look at the consumer stocks, they're traded very expensive. But again, it's a specialist investors. It's not widely known. And in the meantime, we're still dependent on what happens to the oil price, which dictates the sentiment.
Okay, Daniel, if I can go to you. I mean, it's been mentioned already on this program, but there's going to be a whole slew of privatized companies coming out. Is this going to be more attractive to foreign investors? Because we still have, well, like Rosneft and Sberbank, they'll go to the market, but these are state or state-aligned companies here. Do you think investors really want a different play here as the privatization process comes about? I mean, is that going to be something that will be an oasis in this tsunami? Sorry for all the metaphors, but how important is this?
I think privatisation is key for the investment climate here. It makes it clear the government believes in the market. It believes in external finance, in equity investors. I think that is a very strong underpinning for Russian equities, the Russian equity market in general, this understanding the government gets it. They understand the importance of equity markets and financing for companies, that companies will be able to raise capital and grow more quickly and thus boost the economic growth in Russia. So I think everyone wins here. The Russian government wins, they get faster growth, and the investors should win by having a more protected equity environment.
Ben, if I can go back to you, there's always the issue of the corporate wars in corporate boardrooms. We have the TNK-BP ongoing affair with Rosneft. We have Wimbledon. We have Norilsk-Nickel, Rusal. I mean, these make the Wall Street Journal. This makes it into the headlines here. How do you sell Russia and saying, well, this is just business as usual. This happens to all companies here. But that's the story that makes the headlines when it comes to Russian companies to this day.
Yeah, Russia is a young economy, fast-growing. These companies, these businessmen are building large companies, and there's a lot of opportunity. If you look at the West, there's a more status quo. People have established themselves in their niches, and the battle is fought at street level in the terms of marketing and consumers. Whereas here, you've got everything to play for. You've got countries to capture, you've got markets to enter, you've got a consolidation process that's going on. And so, you know, we're still very much in the swashbuckling episode or chapter of Russia's development, and that leads to corporate conflicts.
Natalia, if I can go back to you, when we look at companies going public, is the Russian government doing the right thing? Is the Ministry of Finance doing the right thing? I mean, what I'm saying, are they creating obstacles, or are they creating a better playing field for companies to go out to market? Because there is this perception that when we have to mention the word corruption and things like this that are still in play here, is the state doing the right things to help companies go to market?
Well, I think if we're thinking about Russian, let's say, economic or government policy in terms of, promoting financial market developments, we hear a lot of right things. Like very recently, I would say for a couple of years, we had a very intensive discussion about, creating a global financial center in Russia. There is definitely the willingness to improve the regulation of financial markets. There is the understanding that this improvement of regulation should go hand in hand with the improvement of the legal system. So I think there is a lot of right indication and right indications in announcements. However, in terms of implementation, I think there is always a question, because we all understand that to deal with corruption, to improve the legal system, or even to create the World Financial Center in Russia, this requires a lot of time. This requires a lot of efforts. This requires a lot of systemic changes, and these changes will not just come over a sudden tomorrow. So I think there is definitely the willingness from the government side to help Russian companies, and the privatization, by the way, this is another good indication, because by privatizing, the cabinet will definitely improve the level of competition in the economy, and in a way will help the aggressive and competitive companies to improve their investment case. But I think we still have to wait for the maybe more serious signs precisely in terms of implementation of all these ideas.
Daniel, if I can go to you, and probably you get the last word on the program here. If you could create a hierarchy of things that Russian companies need to do when going to markets, foreign markets at this point in time, what do they need to do? What's the most important thing they do?
Transparency and some kind of track record. They can prove that they can grow. Some kind of stress test. They can explain how they would react in different market conditions. And a great growth story. People want to invest in Russia because of growth. So if it's a good story.
And Dennis, if I can go to you, well, I guess you'll get the last word here. Your company may be going to IPO in the immediate future. What are you doing? What kind of environment are you looking for to be able to do that?
Well, I think it's a lot more than just the environment that's around us. Obviously, macroeconomic factors and industry factors are important, but I would agree with what Daniel's saying. I think it's a story that you can tell. It's the history that allows you to prove that that story can be fulfilled. It's the proper motivation of actually going to the IPO, and it's the right pricing. You need to give the investor an opportunity to earn some money by investing with you. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking at 2012 as a potential investment year for us. It might be shifted to 2013, but so far we believe that it will most likely be in May of 2012.
Okay, it looks like we ended on a very bullish note there. I want to thank my guests today here on the program, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here on the Money. See you next time, and stay with our team.